Chapter 61. 20 years before becoming president, Thomas Jefferson studied accounts of a long river that led to a great continental divide in the Rocky Mountains. By the time he became president, there had already been crossings of the continent, but Jefferson nevertheless asked Congress for a fully funded expedition to the divide and beyond. Commissioning the Corps of Discovery, Jefferson hired Captain Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to lead the expedition. Prior to departure, Lewis and Clark were given access to Jefferson's vast library at Monticello and received training in astronomy and cartography. The expedition departed St. Louis in May of 1804 and traveled up the Missouri River. After passing by the Omaha Territory, the expedition passed through the territory of the Lakota, the Western Sioux, which Clark described as warlike and the vilest miscreants of the savage race. The Lewis and Clark expedition found shelter with the Mandan Nation for the winter before continuing to the headquarters of the Missouri River, 2,300 miles upstream from St. Louis. Solomon Delhut looked down at the Lewis and Clark map upon the table, trying to imagine the square inch marking the continental divide where the Missouri River began. "Perhaps we should have hired Nicollet ourselves," Malcolm Gunn said. Despite wearing small spectacles, Gunn squinted as he read the daily correspondence, making his face shrink up like a rat wriggling its whiskers. Although he and Gunn were close in age, Gunn's head was polished and smooth, leaving only gray hair along the back of his head and near his ears. "Hired him," Delhut repeated. "Clearly we should have discreetly killed him back in Paris." "You are beginning to sound like Schoolcraft." "Stop seeing Nicollet as a threat. If we'd killed Nicollet back in Paris, we would have accomplished nothing. The Drummond map would still be lost, and we would have been pulling single pieces of grass from the mighty haystack while looking for our needle. By allowing Nicollet to live, he has systematically divided up the haystack for us." 2 decades ago, he and Gunn both learned the secret family legacy involved ancient maps and buried treasure. But now Delhut was a businessman with family responsibilities. Instead of chasing the legacy like a zealot, the responsibility only left him bitter. "Then why does all of this feel like such a mistake? I can hear my ancestors crying out from the grave." "Every mile of these expeditions has been cataloged. Not only is this a government expedition, but it is a scientific expedition. When Nicollet finishes, we'll have a day-by-day account of his comings and goings. These accounts will become public documents upon his return, allowing us to study every step against our own documents. Neither Nicollet nor his enemies really understand what we seek." Delhut set the letters from Sibley down. "Would Nicollet be so stupid as to announce his discovery of the Philosopher's Stone? I don't think so. He would keep those secrets to himself." "We don't care if he finds the Philosopher's Stone, Solomon. There are more ways than one to pick a lock. Let him push away the haystack for us and hold the needle up for the world to see. We would see the spot upon which he stands." "I see your point, but others are looking also. The one who killed Lady Drummond," Delhut said, stepping away from the Lewis and Clark map to walk to the other side of the table where the small map of Baron Lahontan sat in contrast. "Interpret these letters for me. What is Nicollet doing this time?" Malcolm Gunn stood up and walked over to the large table. 3 generations ago, your forefathers knew Baron Lahontan had discovered the Undine, but when Lahontan published his map for the world to see, no one knew if it led to others to the true location or throw them off the trail. Having seen the Drummond map, the Lahontan map, and the Le Sueur map, Nicollet has scientifically eliminated the Mississippi River, the St. Peter River, the Des Moines River, and most recently, the Cannon River as candidates for Lahontan's Long River. Now what has he done? Upon returning to Washington, he immediately turned his attention to mapping the Missouri River. What does that tell you? The place where the water flows in all directions is found in the Rocky Mountains. Exactly, Gunn said with a crooked grin once used for boyish mischief. Nicollet is leading us right to the needle. We've already mobilized men to be ready. Who? They are Sons of the Dawn also, extended members of the Sinclair family. There is a fur trading colony in Manitoba that we established a while back, and that will allow us to get to the headwaters of the Missouri River on the heels of Nicollet, should anything of note be discovered. The Order of Eos has men in Canada? At the time, it was a prudent financial move. Now it seems as if the stars have aligned for us. Let the Pied Piper of Savoy lead his band of explorers up the Missouri River. He seems hell-bent on doing all the hard work for us. Chapter 62. Is it true? Will Joseph Nicollet come to Fort Pierre? Kit Carson watched from a distance as the steamship Antelope came around the bend of the Missouri River. Fort Pierre was a wooden stockade with elevated towers on each corner of the square. Inside, a trading post, a few homes, and a tall flagpole flying an American flag could be seen at the center of the court. It was built for accessibility to the river, not for defense or permanence. 24 teepees were set up outside the stockade, and as the ship approached, both traders and Indians began to approach the rickety dock. Vengeance would be a delicate matter, so Carson pushed down all of his rage and grief to take advantage of the opportunity delivered to him. A crooked smile, a drooping shock of hair, smallpox scars beneath his beard. A few weeks earlier, Carson had been at the Green River in Wyoming at a Rocky Mountain rendezvous with a dozen other trappers when he heard from a friend of Captain Billy Stewart that there would be a government expedition departing from Fort Pierre Chateau in late spring or early summer. It is a job for old men or young boys, Carson decided. But when he heard the name Joseph Nicollet, he immediately changed his mind. Surrounding Fort Pierre, tall bluffs were decorated with stunted trees and brush, sliced in half by a turbid, muddy river flowing from the distant Rocky Mountains. Compared to the majesty of the Rockies, it was a terribly barren place. The fort commander rushed to greet an older man in bright clothing, Nicollet, if Carson was to guess. Following him, he saw another scientist and a young officer standing on the dock, overseeing the cargo as it was unloaded from the ship. For a moment, he thought fate had delivered Daniel Lyons back into his clutches. But the demeanor of the man in front of him was different than Lyons. Carson walked between the cut in the river valley where the deposit of sediment dropped another 10 feet to the water's edge. Like himself, the young officer had a full beard, albeit a much nicer uniform. Willie Dixon, an old friend of Stewart, and a few ragged men introduced themselves to the young officer and showed him to the expedition wagons. Carson still had time to join the expedition, but instead, he chose to wait in the shadows, his scalping blade sharp and ready. For the better part of 2 hours, Carson watched for either Lyons or the government agent, the one who brought the supplies from St. Louis, the man with the missing fingers. Neither stepped off the boat, and Kit Carson found himself alone with a whiskey bottle. He leaned against the packed wagons of the Nicollet expedition, armed and dangerous, when the young officer spotted him and boldly walked up from the commander's quarters to the wagons parked in the middle of the yard. Bark at me, and I'll slice off an ear, Carson thought. Are you looking for work? I'm looking for answers, Carson said. Second Lieutenant John C. Fremont, U.S. Corps of Topographical Engineers. How can I help you? You're with this Nicollet fellow? I am. What can you tell me about him? We are on a mapping expedition. We'll be mapping the James River, Devil's Lake, and the watershed of the Red River and St. Peter River. St. Peter, Carson repeated, remembering the name of the steamer that had arrived at Fort Union 2 years earlier. This is a government expedition. It is. We serve under Major Hebert of the U.S. Corps of... I heard you the first time. So you fellows are here to figure out how much land you're going to steal from the Indian? Is that it? I wouldn't characterize it like that. Well, I did. You're thieves, aren't you? No, Mr. Carson. Kit Carson. If you're not thieves, then you're murderers, spreading death to every end of the prairie just like you did in 37. 37? Government men came to Fort Union with supplies tainted with smallpox. From Fort Union, government agents spread disease to every tribe along the Missouri, killing more in one winter than 5 years of war could have accomplished. You bastards killed my wife. Sir, Joseph Nicollet is a friend of the Indian. Last year, we vaccinated countless villages for smallpox. Nicollet counts Chief Sleepy Eyes, Renville, and Winetta as his friends. I can assure you, Nicollet only has the best interests of the Indian in his heart. Do you know a man by the name of Lyons, Daniel Lyons? Fremont shook his head. Lyons? Sorry, I don't know the man. He bragged about serving under Nicollet. This man, this government man, sold me blankets infected with smallpox. Lyons killed my wife the same as if he'd held a pistol to her head and fired. Mr. Carson, there's no man by the name of Lyons with us last year, nor is there this year. Perhaps he served under Nicollet on the 36 expedition. So you don't know this Daniel Lyons. He had smallpox scars, which is why he was certainly chosen to be the harbinger of death. Mr. Carson, I sincerely feel sorrow for the loss of your wife, but none of us had anything to do with the epidemic. If you find this Captain Lyons, bring him to me, and I will serve frontier justice, Carson said, and walked away with a whiskey bottle in one hand and a knife in the other. Chapter 63. Today, much blood will be spilt upon the prairie, Chief Wahnotten thought as he stepped out of his lodge to the fanfare of 2,000 Yankton Indians gathered upon the hunting grounds. Outside of his lodge, his family helped him prepare for the day. His son Juanetta stood holding his decorated spear, while his younger son held a bow and a quiver full of arrows. His daughter stood with his freshly painted horse. Only his wife did not smile. Be careful today. I will be surrounded by hundreds of my finest braves. What do I have to fear? Wahnotten did fear. A deep, penetrating fear chewed away at his bones day after day, stealing away his courage and sucking his heart like marrow. Show no weakness, he told himself as he climbed upon his horse and struck a fierce pose. Remind them who rules. As Wahnotten rode south, he could not shake the dream from his head. His days upon the prairie were coming to an end. But not today. Today, I am supreme. They are traveling north between the two rivers, one of his advance scouts explained. If we send out flankers, we can push them in either direction. There will be no need for flankers. They have trapped themselves. Today, we kill as many as possible. Tomorrow, we will know where to find the rest. Keeping the horses at a steady trot, the heavily armed Yankton warrior crossed 3 miles of open prairie before reaching the top of the ridge. There, on the opposite side of the ridge, their prey waited, unaware. Wahnotten gave the signal, and hundreds of horses sprinted into the valley below. Screams, both in terror and aggression, filled the valley, and in minutes the scent of blood wafted palpable in the air. By the time he reached the valley floor, a dozen buffalo from the massive herd had already fallen. The young men of the tribe had ridden hard to prove themselves, leaving older men such as himself to pick off the weaker members of the herd. For 5 decades, Wahnoton had annually hunted buffalo south of Spirit Lake. While their neighbors had to rely on trickery or terrain to harvest meat for winter, the buffalo herds came up from the south each year to feast upon the lush prairie grass glowing between the sloughs and lakes of his land. Funneling the herds were 2 rivers that stretched hundreds of miles south to the Missouri River. Combined with the massive ridge that separated his lands from the lands of the eastern Dakota, the herds came like clockwork. With a few days of hunting, his people could disperse for the winter, their food supply secure. Burnt Earth, his most trusted lieutenant, came riding in hard from the eastern side of the ridge. "We found wagon tracks." This far south, Wahnoton felt the mood of the day change. For the past decade, the throngs of wagons from the distant Selkirk colony grew bolder and bolder. When he was a boy, his father had pity for the dirty children rejected by both Indian and white culture. But the Métis population grew much faster than expected. In recent years, they would fill each wagon with 10 buffalo before hauling their ill-gotten harvest back into Canada. Wahnoton had left 24 boys to guard the Red River Valley, but the Métis must have found a way past them. "I will come with you," Wahnoton finally decided. "I will remind them who rules these lands. They will have rifles. Show me the way." So upon the ridge they rode, the herd still scattered like leaves blown by the wind. Atop the eastern slope of the ridge, Wahnoton could see the herd parting around a large boulder on the prairie. But on the boulder, he spotted 2 human figures. Burnt Earth noticed them too, and soon a dozen warriors were heading toward the strange sight. As they grew closer, Wahnoton could immediately see they were white men, but neither Métis nor trader. The older man stood upon the top of the stone, waving his arms in the air. He wore a bright red jacket, making it possible to see him from a mile away. "Greetings," the man in the red jacket said in Sioux. "We are friends of Joseph Renville of Lacaparle." He pointed to the east. Renville? Burnt Earth and his other warriors shouted out angry questions, which neither man could answer. In fact, the man in the red jacket kept repeating his introduction, and it became apparent it was the only thing he knew how to say. A half-mile away, as the buffalo herd withdrew like a black wave upon a grassy beach, 4 wagons were parked on the opposite side of the valley, surrounded by his warriors. "I know Joseph Renville," Chief Wahnoton answered in English. "I do not know you. Who are you?" "I am Joseph Nicollet. This is my assistant, Carl Geyer. Those men across the valley are our guides. We were investigating this boulder when the buffalo herd moved south and separated us from our party. We have come to see Lake of Spirit Heart and to visit with Chief Wahnoton of the Yankton." Wahnoton did not smile, but answered his orders to Burnt Earth that the men were now their guests, but whispered. When he spotted his spy, Tiope, the exiled warrior he long ago dubbed Wounded Man, in the wagons with the other white men, Wahnoton knew with certainty Nicollet had been sent by the Great Spirit, and there was much that needed to be discussed. Chapter 64. Devil's Lake is a closed water system that is not fed by tributaries. Only at extremely high water levels does the lake overflow and connect with the Cheyenne River. Like the Great Salt Lake, which also does not drain, it has a high salinity level. With a surface area of 3,800 square miles, it is the largest body of water in North Dakota. Although named Lac du Diable, or Devil's Lake, by the earliest European explorers, the Sioux knew it as Minnewakan, or Spirit Lake. According to legend, a great Unktahi, or water serpent, lived in the depths of the lake, and once wiped out a whole army camped near its shore. From a camp on Heart of Spirit Lake, a prominent mountain on the eastern shore, Joseph Nicollet could see 30 miles in all directions. To the north and east, the Red River tributaries began, flowing to the distant north. To the south, tributaries of the James River flowed all the way back to the Missouri River. Somewhere along the shores, Fremont obtained all the scientific data he needed. Nicollet did not need to visit any of the turtle-shaped islands. He had an audience with Chief Wahhatonten. The old Yankton chief seemed as prehistoric as the rocks upon the boulders slopes of the mountain. Although he still had broad shoulders, age had hunched his back and taken all color from his hair. His arms were still strong and quick, but his hands shook whenever holding things. He met 5 generations of the chief's family. Nicollet reckoned the chief age to be over 90. Beside Wahhatonten, Tiope and Wanetta also sat around the fire. After standing in the towering presence of Wanetta, Nicollet could imagine the elder chief once in his prime. The strange green glasses worn by the chief's son helped fight a degenerative condition caused by snow blindness. "It is time for us to speak plainly," Wahhatonten finally said. "It is," Nicollet smiled. "I have visited the haunted valley, and I have found the old fort. I have also found places where the earth bleeds blue, but I have not found the white egg of the Sioux, the water drum of the Chippewa, the magnum opus of my people." Nicollet glanced at Tiope, knowing none of his secrets were kept from Wahhatonten, but Tiope has not seen everything. Nicollet reached into the satchel he was carrying and took out 6 tin canisters. Nicollet tapped out a little from each canister onto a buried boulder until there were 5 piles upon the stone. "My people call this substance vitriol," Nicollet began, "and I have searched far and wide for the legendary place where waters flow in all directions. I have found many types of blue earth. Can you tell me which of these 6 samples is the one that came from the haunted valley?" Wahhatonten touched each of the piles of blue-green sediment. Some were gritty, others spongy, and others sandy. His index finger prodded each before he said, "You are trying to trick me. Can you tell?" Wahhatonten leaned back. "2 of these samples are the same." "Which 2 are the same?" Wahhatonten pointed to the piles gathered at Fort La Houlier and another. "Why did you single out these 2 piles?" "There is an evil spirit upon the 2 of these piles." "An evil spirit?" Nicollet repeated. "Like the one that lives in the lake, the Unctahi?" Wahhatonten shook his head. "I have lived a long life, and I have seen how tales can change in the telling. I do not let my people camp along these shores because an Unctahi dwells here. I have brought them here so they can be safe from the Unctahi." "Of course. This body of water does not have a tributary or outlet. It is cut off. The Unctahi cannot reach this place by water?" "That is my belief, but evil grows, and so does the power of the Unctahi. Not long after I began my journey, a strange shaman visited me in St. Louis, claiming that I had been sent by the Great Spirit. When I arrived in the land of the Chippewa, one of their prophets also believed I had been sent. Even Chief Thunderface of the Tzaptonans claimed I was the great sorcerer. Am I the Wishwe, the Starman?" "Perhaps. But the stars have sent others also. Twice in my life, I have seen the Serpent Star. When I was a boy, the elders told me how they also had seen this strange omen when they were boys. 3 sightings of Halley's Comet, 1835, 1758, and 1682. what happened the last 2 times the serpent star came. For countless generations, my people performed a sacred duty, even if its purpose was not known by all. We were the Santee, the guardians of the frontier. By telling tales of a haunted valley? What did they guard? A place? An object? They guarded time. Time? What about the tale of Wishwe? Isn't the treasure a white egg? The white egg is only a small part of the tale. As guardians of the frontier, we had a purpose, and as long as we performed our sacred duty, our people remained strong. That is why I say we guarded time. When my grandfather was a boy, a man such as yourself never would have crossed the Mississippi but with your life. But now you ride openly upon the buffalo lands because my people are weak. What happened in your grandfather's time? What happened in 1682? You should know, Wahhatonten said, looking at Tiope. You have been to the haunted valley. White men came, Nicollet said. They made a fort and dug in the haunted valley. Did they find something? Did Lesueur really unearth the Philosopher's Stone? Yes, they found something, but they did not wake the creature No Soul. Our long watch as guardians of the frontier finally ended, and as a result, the time we protected came to an end. Nicollet looked at the canisters of vitriol, knowing that Wahhatonten had supported a theory that still needed study and verification. When you were a boy, the serpent star also appeared. What happened then? The white egg was lost, passing from one tribe to another, bringing with it death and disaster. When I was a young man, I rode to war with Chief Blackhorse of the Metawakanton to reclaim the sacred treasure. But its secrets died with those who had it last. Yet it festers, and it brings death and illness with it. When the serpent star returned, I prayed for the healing of my people. If we have reached the end, and you are Wishwe, then I rejoice that I have lived long enough to see the death and destruction of No Soul. And if I'm not Wishwe, then I task you to become Santee, a guardian of the frontier. Yes, be a champion for my people. Fight for us. Fight for time. Chapter 65. Second Lieutenant John C. Fremont carefully packed away the barometer, tending to it exactly as Nicollet had instructed him. The survey of Devil's Lake was complete, and the rest of the men grew restless, and the men grew restless after a week of inactivity. The fertile land had a greenish hue to it, and having seen it from all angles now, he took one last look, knowing they would soon be leaving. Did Nicollet finally find what he was looking for? Devil's Lake felt like the far side of the world, and civilization had only been a childhood dream. In the distance, he saw Wannetta and Tiope flanking Nicollet as they returned from the mountain camp of Chief Wahhatonten. Fremont finished packing away the survey equipment and then secured it in the wagon before returning. Even then, he put on the guise of expedition leader, giving Nicollet an update of the supplies and their travel readiness while previewing the path they would take across the head of the Coteau to arrive at Lacaparo by the end of August. Nicollet nodded, but did not seem to hear a word Fremont said. I met a warrior of Wahhatonten that claimed nothing happens upon the prairie without their chief knowing, so I asked about Geyer's missing wagon. Nicollet finally seemed to listen. And what did you learn? It was not stolen by Indians. They thought you found something, didn't they? They thought you found something, didn't they? I was watched every step of the way when we left Fort Snelling last year, but you? You managed to slip away twice, bringing Geyer with you both times. They had to assume you'd found something, which is why the wagon was stolen. Did you find something? It is best I don't involve you, Johnny. Do you remember the day you took me to the Santee River in South Carolina to see the burial mounds? How could I forget? It is the day I pledged my loyalty to Nicollet. What does that have to do with anything? Chief Wahanaton told me how his people were guardians of the frontier. The Santee have been at war for a long time, and I have just become one of them. Become one of them? How? When my journey began, it began as a quest, a treasure hunt of sorts. You asked why they'd steal Geyer's wagon. I was shown a map and was asked to find a treasure before evil men found it first. What kind of treasure? It is hard for me to say without sounding like a total fool. I've spent the better part of this decade trying to understand it myself, often questioning my sanity. Just when I think I've lost my mind, I find another piece of the puzzle, confirming the insanity. If I tell you, I worry I will lose you. You could never lose me. I'll be your servant to the end. The map that brought me to this place described a possible resting place of the legendary Philosopher's Stone. The magical rock that turns lead into gold? An alkahest, yes. In the legends, the byproduct of the Philosopher's Stone was vitriol, copper vitriol. Nicollet then produced several tins, and upon opening them, revealed blue vitriol in each one. Ironically, I believe I've identified the resting place, but I've been entangled by my own web. I know what to do, but I cannot risk doing it. Tell me what needs to be done. First, I will return to Washington and shout from the highest peaks about the welfare of the Indian. I will not let them be portrayed as thieving savages or cartoonish brutes. I will wage war in every university and institution that will have me. And me, how can I help? When we return, Colonel Aber will want his map, which I must provide, but you will begin planning a grander expedition. My next expedition will take me to the source of the Missouri River, far away in the Rocky Mountains. Is that where the treasure is located? Nicollet packed away the canisters and tucked his journal back inside of his jacket. He patted Fremont on the shoulder. Of course not, but we will make them believe it is. Chapter 66. Jim Tyope found one of Renville's canoes still waiting at the Fort Snelling landings. Instead of ringing the bell for the ferry, he climbed into the canoe alone. Nicollet, Geyer, and Fremont had heeded his warning and returned to St. Louis, Nicollet by ship and Fremont by land, to unnecessarily guard another mysterious wagon of plant specimens. During a single summer, the number of residents living on the eastern shore of the Mississippi had almost doubled. Although just 26 years old, Tyope felt as if he'd lived 100 lives already. With the absconded canoe, he crossed the river and pulled up next to the ferry. Night came early now that fall arrived, and the homes of Sibley and Faribault were lit. The chimneys puffed smoke into the night sky. Tyope found himself climbing the steep path that led to an old fur trader's cabin. Old Betts sat on the small porch with a plaid blanket draped on her shoulders. Beside her, Pierre Bottineau, a Métis man in his early 20s with French, Sioux, and Chippewa blood, smoked a pipe. Seeing Tyope approach, old Betts rose from her rocking chair with a groan and took a few steps to the edge of her deck. Although the cabin was not home, Tyope nevertheless knew it well. "What will you do now?" old Betts asked. The question had the effect of punching him in the gut. His knees wobbled. Despite the unexplained presence of Bottineau, Taupi fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around the legs of old Betts, weeping into the fabric of her dress. Old Betts brushed away his hat, and her old fingers began to comb through his hair, touching the places where a Chippewa axe had stolen his childhood. "Ina," Taupi said, and began to sob, having spoken the word mother in the language of his birth. Taupi sensed Bottineau, and wiping his tears with the back of his hands, he looked up to see the young man now standing. "Why are you here?" Taupi asked, his tears making him even more terrifying to behold. "Pierre came to me on his own accord, asking for forgiveness," his mother said. Taupi stood, stepping past his mother as he ascended the 3 steps to the wooden porch. His hand found the deer horn hilt of his knife. "What is your crime?" "Theft," Bottineau said quickly, and then offered his 2 open hands to Taupi. "What did you steal?" Taupi said, standing so close that Bottineau was forced to withdraw his hands. "I was hired to help bring a wagon down to St. Louis, but at Prairie du Chien, I brought it east, delivering it to Fort Atkinson instead." Geyer's wagon, Taupi realized. Although it contained priceless botanical specimens, its value was almost worthless to anyone but a scientist. "Who did you give it to?" I do not know the man at Fort Atkinson." "Then who paid you to steal the wagon?" Bottineau's eyes turned to the stone house. "Hank Sibley." The knife sprang from its sheath almost as fast as Taupi pivoted toward the house. His long legs neared a run as he heard his mother calling out for him. A moment later, he kicked open Sibley's door. An infant cried and 2 dogs barked. Sibley sat at the fire in a plush chair. One of the exotic dogs snapped at Taupi, and his knife dispatched it with such suddenness that the other dog ran away. Sibley's eyes widened. Taupi rushed forward, tossing tables and chairs aside until he lifted Sibley by the shirt, pinning him against the fireplace and holding a knife under his chin. "You've just become an outcast," Taupi told himself about his bold actions, but he knew the man was a spy. "I know what you've done." Sibley just blinked in terror. "There will be no lawyers, no judges, and no juries for your crimes. Only my knife will decide your fate," Taupi whispered through clenched teeth. "Now, are you going to make a confession or face immediate justice?" "A confession? I don't know what you think I've done, but I can assure you, who do you work for?" "You know who I work for. I'm an employee of—" "Who wanted the wagon?" Taupi clarified himself, digging a hole deeper and deeper. "The wagon?" Taupi pressed the cold blade to Sibley's throat. "I don't know them. They are friends of my father, and—" Before Sibley could finish, footsteps echoed loudly on the front porch. Instead of Pierre Bottineau, Big Mo Maxwell, wearing pants with suspenders over his hairy white chest, stepped through the doorway with a rifle. At first, the rifle tip stayed near his feet, but then it abruptly drew up and leveled at Taupi. "Put the knife down, Taupi. The loyal dog has come to his master's aid." "Not until he tells me the truth." Maxwell took a few more steps into the room, stepping around the slain dog near the door. "There is no escape now." "Put the knife down and we'll talk," Taupi insisted. But Taupi knew Sibley was a snake that would somehow wriggle free of any consequence. He wondered if he could throw the knife at Maxwell, wrestle the rifle away, and turn it on Sibley. It is a foolish plan, one that does not help Nicollet or my people. With each step Maxwell took toward him, the end came closer and closer. Taupi turned back to Sibley, putting his face inches away. "Who stole the wagon?" Through the chaos of a crying baby and barking dog, Taupi somehow heard the cock of a pistol. It was neither one of Sibley's men, or old Betts, or Bottineau. Instead, he saw Red Blanket Woman, her long black hair unbraided and flowing wildly over her nightgown with a calico blanket wrapped around her body. In her small hands, a pistol pointed at Big Mo Maxwell. "Put down your rifle," Red Blanket Woman said, clearly in English. Maxwell, ever the coward, lowered it immediately, and when she leveled it at his face, he set it on the nearby table and raised his empty hands. Ignoring the cries of her child, Red Blanket Woman turned the pistol toward Tiope and Sibley. Put the knife down, Sugmanitu Tanka. I would not have you murder the father of my child." "Tiope, I am Tiope. Sugmanitu Tanka died when the Chippewa crushed my face and cut off my scalp." Hearing his given name tossed a bucket of cold water upon his rage, and he realized the barbarity of his act. While the blade remained at Sibley's throat, Tiope stepped away from his prey, the knife at the end of his arm's length. Then he took one step sideways, keeping the knife pointed at Sibley. The pistol's aim did not follow him. "Pick up the rifle," Red Blanket Woman said, but not to Sibley. She said it to Tiope. She said it to him. Tiope brushed up against Maxwell as he grabbed the rifle from the table, but before he could do anything, Red Blanket Woman said, "If you promise not to hurt the father of my child, I will tell you all about the men who sent those letters." She was never a peace offering. She was a carefully planted spy, Tiope realized. "What about your daughter?" He would have cast us both aside when the time suited him. Let him raise her as a reminder of what could have been between our two peoples, if greed had not ruined everything. Tiope backed up toward the door, having made more than just a mess on the floor. As he leveled the rifle at the two faithful servants of the American Fur Company, he felt a small hand upon his shoulder as Red Blanket Woman led him backwards to the door. Once outside, he let go of the rifle with one hand, and taking her hand in the other, pulled her along as they both ran toward the river, where a canoe waited to take them away into the protection of darkness. Chapter 67. "I think I love him," Jessie Ann Benton decided as her octet finished their performance and applause rained down on them. Returning to her pew along the side of the hall, Jessie caught her breath as the exhilaration ran its course. The Georgetown Men's Quartet walked to the stage of the Old North Auditorium, providing Jessie a musical score as she sorted through her feelings. Her blush calmed slightly as she looked up from her knees and into the crowd of Washington, D.C.'s elites. Amongst the sea of faces, she first caught the eyes of her mother, sisters, and father, so she gave a little nod and looked back down to her knees. After a few measures, she looked back at the men singing. Most of them were smooth-faced boys, even if they were a few years older than her and approaching 20. Not a single one of them had a rugged beard or a sharp military uniform. "The United States Corps of Topographical Engineers," she repeated the military branch that had given her trouble a few days earlier. Jessie looked back up again, scanning the crowd for a moment, only to lock eyes with the handsome second lieutenant who had delivered on his promise to see her performance. "Lieutenant Fremont," her father had said 2 days earlier. "Of course I know him. He's the apprentice of Joseph Nicollet." It had startled her that her father immediately remembered him, so she quickly dropped the subject, lest her father press why she'd seen him at Georgetown University campus. Although Fremont interrupted his plans to speak with her for 10 minutes, she never found out why he'd been on campus after his celebrated return to civilization. Jessie sat with the other girls from the Georgetown Seminary until the Christmas concert came to an end, but to her surprise, only her mother and sisters rushed to her side for congratulations. Her father had found Lieutenant Fremont. "Don't appear too desperate," she thought as she accepted the praise from her family, but with each glance she saw a larger and larger crowd gathering. but not because of her father. Senators, Catholic priests, and Washington elites soon gathered around the handsome second lieutenant. "Where's father?" Jessie finally asked, playing ignorant. Her mother and sisters followed as they crashed the circle surrounding Fremont. She wisely ignored her invited guest and went right to her daddy, who put aside his political focus to gush about his daughter. Two conversations continued in orbit in the same space as Jessie took compliments about her singing and appearance, and Lieutenant Fremont answered questions about the frontier. The Benton clan ran out of subject quickly, and the voice of Fremont caught all those nearby. "Actually, sir, we named a lake in your honor. It was one of the grandest lakes I encountered on the prairie. It stretched on for miles in all directions, and from our camp, I could almost not see the other shore. Near it, we found Lake Hebert, and 2 days earlier, we discovered Lake Benton." "Did you hear that, Thomas?" Jessie's mother asked. "They named a lake after you." Fremont glanced at Jessie. He'd told her a different story, that of all the lakes he'd seen 2 years ago, Lake Benton was the most beautiful, leaving him no choice but to demand Nicollet name it after her. "Lake Poncet," the slender gentleman beside Fremont repeated. "Lake Hebert, Lake Benton. Nicollet certainly understands who butters his bread." They all chuckled at the joke. Jessie now remembered the handsome, albeit older, gentleman who dropped off a flowering plant to her father. A poinsettia, Jessie remembered, named in honor of the Secretary of War, Joel Poncet. Fremont has been ambushed by his boss. "You've made South Carolina proud, Lieutenant Fremont." Secretary Poncet remained at the center of conversation. "Not since Lewis and Clark has Washington been so captivated by the Great Plains. I am honored to have assisted such a promising career. But tell me, where is Nicollet? You've been back from Washington for nearly 3 weeks, yet Major Hebert told me Nicollet's offices remain empty." "I parted way with Professor Nicollet at Fort Snelling. He left ahead of me by ship while I tended to the wagon of scientific specimens we collected along the Missouri and at Devil's Lake. By the time I arrived in St. Louis, I was told he'd gone up the Ohio River." "He's been missing for 4 weeks?" Poncet clarified. "I wouldn't worry about Professor Nicollet. He is most likely entertaining friends in Tennessee for the holidays. I'm sure he'll return by the first of the year so we can begin working on the map and begin planning the next expedition." "The next expedition?" Senator Benton asked. "You've only just returned." Jessie felt a flutter of disappointment. Another expedition would take him away for months and send him into more danger. "I was led to believe your expedition was a success," Poncet said morosely. "It certainly was a success," Fremont insisted, "but Professor Nicollet wants to map the Missouri River north of Fort Pierre to provide a complete map of the vast northern watershed. Perhaps after he provides his map of the upper Mississippi," Poncet said. "After all, I have forts to build and thousands of miles to conquer and civilize." Then he turned to Jessie. "Miss Benton, everything about this evening was simply lovely." Joel Poncet took her hand and kissed it before vanishing into the crowd. 3 Jesuit priests stood in the clearing, waiting for Fremont. "I concur with Secretary Poncet. After months out on the prairie, your voice reminded me of the splendors of civilization. Thank you, Miss Benton, for the invitation." Jessie melted, which her father seemed to notice. So did her mother. "Mr. Fremont, in lieu of Professor Nicollet's return, you should come visit our home and regale us with tales of the frontier." "It would be an honor," Fremont said, and then deftly deferred to her father. "Senator Benton surely knows the locations of my office, where he can reach me. I bid you all a Merry Christmas." Lieutenant Fremont turned and was swept up by the priests who ran Georgetown, leaving Jessie with a stunning realization. John Fremont is coming to my house. Chapter 68. The Capitoline Museums of Rome are housed in a single building with four massive wings that form a trapezoidal plaza designed by Michelangelo. Built near the center of the ancient city, the archaeological museums house some of the most important bronzes, statues, and artifacts in the world. Although opened to the public in 1734 by Clement XII, the museum contains collections featuring Rome's pagan past, including the statue of Remus and Romulus. On a balcony bench on the second floor of the Palazzo dei Conservatori, facing the she-wolf suckling her adopted human infants, Conrad Simmons patiently waited. Most of his time was now spent at the Vatican, 2 miles away on the other side of the Tiber. His days of investigating secret societies were now over, for his superior had recently ascended to the rank of cardinal, thanks to Pope Gregory's support and patronage. Simmons' duties were now administering investigations on a much more global scale, yet one loose string remained: Nicollet. Giovanni, the old custodian, appeared first from the service door with a broom in his hand. His lively eyes twinkled as he looked over to the stone bench, but then he turned to tend to other apartments within the museum. A moment later, Father Lupo emerged from the custodial closet to join Simmons at the stone bench at the balcony. "It has been a while," Lupo said. "Who would have thought the watchmaker's son would have given us so much to talk about? What have you learned?" "Not much beyond what any other man couldn't learn by reading a newspaper," Lupo teased. "Nicollet is using his sudden fame to wage war against the Van Buren administration, it would seem. Every lecture he gives only fans the flames of his reputation, bringing larger crowds and more honorary titles. Not only has he failed to produce his map in a timely fashion, but rumors of a book on Indian customs have proven contrary to the wishes of those who control the purse strings in Washington." "Yes," Simmons said. "It is why we must withdraw him immediately, for his own good." "Withdraw him immediately? Didn't you hear me? Nicollet is more of a celebrity as a map maker than he ever was as an astronomer. We can't just snatch him off the street without notice. If we faked his death and dropped him off on a deserted island, no doubt a fellow scientist would discover him while studying sea turtles." "We must try something. We are the ones who put him on this path. I've tried. We've even enlisted the help of our Belgian friend, only to have Nicollet refuse our help." "He refused to submit." "He did, repeatedly, so do not trouble your soul with guilt. Nicollet seems intent on captaining his own ship through the angry seas. He is making plans for another expedition. How could he? With what money? Who would he take? As I said, he has all but gone to war with the Van Buren administration. American politics can change with the tide. President Van Buren will not win a second term, and this fall, a new administration will control the purse strings. Nicollet seems to have anticipated this." Father Lupo handed him a letter addressed to Father de Smet, written by Nicollet. In it, Nicollet gives an account of the past 2 years in Washington, D.C., including numerous setbacks such as the Corps of Topographical Engineers redeploying Fremont to Iowa. He wrote of the plight of the American Indians and his efforts to educate the colleges and universities about the truth. At the end, he plainly stated his plans to map the upper Missouri River near the Canadian Rockies, which he finished by writing, "Sound the trumpets in Rome, for once this first woe passes, the lost key might be found." "The lost key?" Simmons repeated aloud. "I would like to apologize for my earlier reservations about Nicollet. You were right about him. He is a faithful and determined servant." "Does this mean he found it?" "If he actually found it, I do not think he would be trying to warn us. Nicollet might think he knows something, but until he has it, it will be no different than the others." Woe, trumpet, key. "Father Lupo, Now I must insist that we recall him so we might question him what he learned, as well as question him further about his understanding. I would like to see what the Lord intends for him, Father Lupo said. Let's see what Nicollet discovers with the next expedition, and then we will bring him back so that we can speak with him. I have left him in a pit surrounded by vipers, Fremont decided as he walked from Union Station to the map room where he once cursed. After months in exile, banished from Washington for reasons both personal and political, Fremont almost broke into a run. "Welcome back to Washington, Captain Fremont," a stranger said as he passed by on the wooden sidewalk. Fremont turned around, hoping to catch another glance, but the stranger was gone. Another 100 yards passed before another complete stranger looked up and smiled. Again, Fremont neither recognized the man nor had any affiliation with him. Upon reaching the United States Topographical Engineer's office, the greetings were based solely on his rank, now as a captain. It wasn't until he reached the offices of Colonel Hebert that he knew his greeter. After a lengthy chiding, Fremont left Hebert's office with his tail between his legs and went upstairs to the offices of the United States Coast Survey offices. "Captain Fremont," the men greeted him with smiles, allowing him to be an excuse to stop their tedious work. Even though many of the men were new, some much younger than him, they vigorously shook his hand as if they knew him. Fremont walked up the narrow staircase just as he had done for most of 1940. At the top of the stairs, he found the large office given to them by Joel Ponset. There, on the massive dining room table, he saw the infamous map of the upper Mississippi hydrological basin. "Johnny Fremont!" Nicollet rose from a plush chair in the corner of the room and nearly ran across the room. Nicollet threw his arms around him, hugging the man tightly. "Have you grown, or have I simply shrunk?" Fremont could see the truth, but didn't answer. Despite the bulk of the wool jacket, lavender scented, Nicollet felt rail thin underneath, and his hair was now almost white. "It is Captain John C. Fremont now. It has been a long time since I was that young man you met back in South Carolina. People in Washington did not know I was born a bastard. I've moved up in the world. After my little reprimand, I was worried they had taken you away from me. But you've come back," Nicollet gushed, smiling affectionately at his protege. "Now my plans can continue." Then Nicollet let go and rushed over to the windows. He flung open the curtains, allowing the light to stream in. Above the table, two sparkling chandeliers cast reflections like the stars in heaven around the room. The massive white canvas almost glowed when the light struck it, but Fremont immediately noticed all of the ink upon it. "You've made tremendous progress since I left. You should be proud. What in the world did you do to the room?" "I simply made it a little more French," Nicollet smiled. "It helped ease the loss of my prized assistant. So tell me all about the West." "The truth will break his heart." Fremont leaned against the massive table, and Nicollet leaned against the windowsill, his hands on his hips, as usual. "Affairs are bad. Then it is as I feared. Mind you, I spent my exile surveying the Des Moines, but where there were only 3 outposts back in 1838, now there are more than 30 settlements. Expansion is happening at a far more alarming rate than you even predicted. Any news from Chief Wahanaton, or Sleepy Eyes, or Flatmouth? Do you remember that vile boy who started the fires? I wonder whatever became of him." "I never heard. I spent much of my time in Iowa." "Have you heard the plans proposed by Senator Benton?" Nicollet pressed with a slight grin at the mention of Benton. "Why does my old friend try to hurt me so? How did I ever wound him?" "I've not seen Benton since my return. I try not to think of him." "Ah, I know better than that, Johnny. Senator Benton has hurt your pride. but your stubbornness will only serve his purposes." "What do you mean? What has he proposed?" "He is planning to once again move the Winnebago Indians, to act as a buffer between tribes. He is going to push them into the lands of the Dakota. Can you imagine the ripple effect of this ignorant move? After the Van Buren administration was swept away, I found hope in the promises of President Harrison, but now your new masters, Benton and Spencer, will create chaos in the West, then offer the military as a solution. Laframbo knew this was coming years before it happened." "Senator Benton is not my master. Why would you say such a thing after what he did to me?" Fremont realized his voice had risen in anger and quickly collected himself. "Your work is nearing completion, I see. You have Colonel Hebert in a twist over the delays. Let them wait." Nicollet shook his head dismissively and reached over to the dull green box with his initials on it. Fremont had seen the box on both expeditions. Nicollet unlocked it with a key he kept around his neck and opened it, glancing up at Fremont. Inside the box, there was all sorts of clutter. Folded and rolled documents, journals, a piece of red pipestone, trinkets, and even a turtle shell filled the box. Nicollet found a notebook and took it out. "While you were in Iowa, I have been making preparations for our next expedition. I have prepared a list of materials as well as people I feel we can trust. In order for it to work, Professor Nicollet, I have spoken to Hebert. The Tyler administration wants me to be the public face of the 1842 expedition. If we play our cards right, I might be able to bring you with." "Bring me with?" Nicollet repeated with a sigh. "I do not have the energy for 2 expeditions." "2 expeditions?" Nicollet looked down at the box. "I am losing the fight, Johnny. Last March, Congress had appropriated funds for a new expedition. I was to be its leader, but at a party, I publicly began to describe the Chippewa and Sioux to a group of men professing to be my friends. I told them of my plans to take notes and turn it into a book, defending the Indians to the world as something far different than savage. In the course of a couple weeks, President Harrison died and you were sent to Des Moines. I underestimated the will of my enemies. I don't understand how any of those things connect. As soon as the Indian is gone, the West will be theirs. I returned to Washington believing I could defend the Indian, but now I realize I should have gone on the offensive. I have wasted too much time. Now President Tyler has opened the floodgates to the West, leaving me behind as a slave to my own creation." "President Harrison died of pneumonia," Fremont protested. "I was sent to the Des Moines because I overstepped my position in trying to court Jussie Benton." "Punishment?" Nicollet scoffed. "I was the one being punished. Without you by my side, I was left overwhelmed by this mapping project, leaving me unable to proceed on my other endeavors until it was done." "Your book on Indian life?" "And by sending you to the Des Moines, they determined that my apprentice had now become a master. I will not be going with you on the next expedition. I can guarantee as much. I have been making plans for a private expedition." "A private expedition? To where?" Nicollet handed him a key. "What is this for?" "It is a contingency if I should be unable to complete the map." "Why wouldn't you be able to complete the map?" Despite his aging body, Nicollet's smile still remained strong. "A man can give a speech in the rain one day and die of pneumonia a few weeks later. Even great men are mere mortals, able to succumb to a variety of illnesses. I am on the verge of publishing my map, and in it, I will leave clues for my allies and enemies to discover. Between your trip to the upper Missouri and the publication of my map, we will create a campaign of misinformation." "What do you mean?" Nicollet flipped the pages of the journal to a rough sketch of the monstrosity on the table. "I will attempt to publish my map with these phrases upon it. I worry they will change my map before releasing it to the public. As soon as I submit it, though, my life will be in danger. In danger? It took Fremont a few moments to understand. Then he saw the route Nicollet had taken after sending him to the Zumbro. Instead of the Cannon River, he saw the Lahontan River. Instead of the Laprelle River, he saw the Le Sueur River. A very small X identified Fort LaHoulier. And the entire region south of the Minnesota River was labeled as the Undine region. He is publishing the location of the Philosopher's Stone. Chapter 70. It took 2 bottles of wine before Nicollet explained his plans for the private expedition, and even then he worried he had frightened Fremont away. Yet Fremont remained transfixed by the contents of the green box, especially the journal, which he slowly flipped through a second time. So you believe the Philosopher's Stone is some sort of key? It seems the answer to the riddle, Nicollet said, glancing at the tins of copper vitriol he'd unpacked. So while I am preparing for my expedition, I still need you to continue the quest. And you think the Upper Missouri will provide answers? No, but others will think it is Lahontan's Long River. Do you know the legend of the Fisher King? It's a King Arthur legend, isn't it? It is. I read the stories when I was a boy and almost forgot about them until the day Shagobay told me his story of the Fisher Cat, who fought a powerful sorcerer that tried to cheat death. Did I ever share the story with you? No, Professor Nicollet. One tale at a time, I suppose. The Fisher King was a guardian of the Holy Grail, but once he was wounded, the land suffered as he suffered. You see, Johnny, the Fisher King was crippled, which kept him from journeying out into the wild. Stuck at his home, only able to eat fish, he had to rely on other knights to finish the quest for him. Eventually, with proper tutelage, Sir Percival ended up finding the Holy Grail, brought it back to the old king, and ended up healing the crippled king and the land. In this analogy, do you liken yourself to the Fisher King and I am the young knight? Don't give up on yourself, Professor. You still have journeys left to take. I am 55 years old, Johnny. I honestly don't know how that happened so suddenly. It seems like just the other day I met Laplace as a young man in Paris. And now I am Laplace, helping a young man begin his career. I've been chasing after one obsession after another for the better part of 4 decades. And what do I have to show for it? A green box? Well, it is time to think of someone besides myself for a change. Nicollet put the contents back in the box and closed it loudly, locking it with the second key. What is that supposed to mean? Fremont asked. Do not trouble yourself about the paranoia from a crazy old wizard. I have plans for a wedding. Nicollet removed his pocket watch and looked at it. I do not have much time to explain, but rest assured, preparations have been made. Who is getting married? You are. You and that sweet Jessie Benton will be married by the end of the day. Nicollet tried to stand, but felt the room swim after so much celebratory wine. Fremont looked as if he'd seen no soul himself climb out of the hole in the floor. You can't be serious. I haven't seen her for months. Please. How do you think you came by her love letters in Iowa? She would bring them by to me on her way to Georgetown University, and I would send them off to my friends at the Jesuit College of St. Louis, who would then give them to you. It will bring me great joy to see the two of you happily married. You are doing this to upset Senator Benton. Nicollet smirked. Yes, but also for you 2 children. If it is the only good thing I do in my life, I would be satisfied. A colleague of mine, Bishop Vandevelde of St. Louis, is in town on business. He has agreed to marry the 2 of you this evening at Whitemarsh. What in the world is this? Do you want to marry the girl or not? She certainly wants to marry you. Of course I do, but this would be political suicide. Senator Benton would ruin me. Will he have a choice? Nicollet asked sharply as he slipped his primary key back into his shirt pocket. He could pay to have me killed. Ah, now you are starting to think like a man instead of a boy. Nicollet grabbed his overcoat and began to collect his things. But he won't do such a thing. And why not? Because then he would need me to lead the expedition. I have caught him in my own trap, mon enfant. He has no other choice than to accept you as his son-in-law. If I am wrong, then you will be happily married to Jessie. If you are wrong, you will have your old job back and I'll be left behind. Or worse, Benton could shoot me. Trust me, Johnny, I am not wrong about this. You will keep them distracted while I finish my masterpiece. What are you planning? Fremont asked. A knock came from the doorway, and a stranger's voice called out, Mr. Nicollet, the carriage is waiting below. Nicollet saw a brooding man in the doorway. Johnny, this is a very good friend that you can trust. He is going to take you out to White Marsh, where your precious Jessie is waiting. What about you? You are about to have the most exciting year of your life. I will be making preparations for the most exciting year of mine. First, I must finish the map that has become both a blessing and a curse. Next, I will continue my defense of the Indians of the Great Plains. And while you explore the upper Missouri, I will be making preparations. I will be preparing my own team for a less public expedition. Fremont stood blinking. I don't know what to say, Professor. You are like the father I never had. I don't know how to thank you. I will fight the darkness by bringing a little light into the world. Nicollet took him by the arm and led him off to his waiting bride. Be sure you do not lose the key to my chest. If I fail, you must find my private journal before they do. Until this map is finished, it is precious to me as Jessie is to you. Chapter 71. Even after the applause died, the curtains closed, and the custodians began cleaning up the lecture hall, a large crowd waited to ambush Nicollet in the college commons of University Hall. Although Asa Gray had only recently changed offices from the University of Michigan to Harvard, he still swelled with pride at the reception given to Nicollet. But even if I must wait all night, I will set things right while I have the opportunity. While others pressed forward to introduce themselves to Nicollet, Gray waited patiently, hoping for the smallest audience possible before meeting Nicollet with such a shameful pretext. For the better part of 2 years, Gray had waited for an opportunity to speak with Nicollet, but the Frenchman was a whirlwind of activity despite being twice his own age. From week to week, Nicollet would take up new residences, staying with the Bentons, the Tollivers, Ferdinand Hassler, the Jesuits at White Marsh or Georgetown, and a private residences in unknown locations. Despite claims of long hours at the Corps of Topographical Engineer offices, Nicollet would give lectures in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Niagara Falls, and even a surprise trip to St. Louis. For this reason, Asa Gray waited for Nicollet to come to him at Harvard. The crowd waiting in the college commons was a strange mix: crusty old professors, ambitious young men, and even a large contingency of female undergraduates from nearby Radcliffe College waiting to meet the man. Although Gray had only recently turned 30, he'd spent his 20s drifting from field to field to recognize the scientific menagerie gathered for Nicollet's lecture. Astronomers, geologists, botanists, anthropologists, historians, and a few politicians came to listen to the celebrity. If Nicollet had a book to sell, he'd be independently wealthy by the end of the night, Gray realized as an hour ticked by. Gray positioned himself by the next exit door, knowing that if Nicollet tired of fame and made a run for it, he'd still be able to speak the words that would undoubtedly stop him in his tracks. Many in the crowd departed, and Gray found himself standing beside a familiar face. "Dr. Jackson, how have you been?" Charles Thomas Jackson gave a perplexed look. 5 years older than Gray, he had the good fortune of settling into his career already. He now had spectacles, a receding hairline, and a full beard, but shaved lips. Gray had been a boy when he spent a summer working for the Harvard geologist during his survey of Nova Scotia, which is why he finally relented with a, "I'm sorry, you are Asa Gray, professor of botany here at your alma mater, but I worked with you and Francis Alger on your geological survey." "Nova Scotia," Jackson snapped. "It's been a while. So are you a professor at Harvard now? Congratulations." "Thank you, Dr. Jackson. Did you see the lecture?" "Yes, he is a peculiar little fellow, isn't he? When he gets worked up, I can barely understand his English. I'd hoped to hear more about his study of the Missouri River rather than the talk about Indians, but Professor Nicollet asked me for a favor, so here I am." "What sort of favor?" Gray asked. "Oh, Professor Nicollet and I had a chance encounter while he was staying at Niagara Falls, and when he'd heard I studied at Nova Scotia, he began to press me on matters of both Indians and geology. During his expeditions, he took copper samples, and since that is now my specialty, I told him I'd analyze the specimens. He wrote that he'd be coming to Harvard, so it seemed like the right opportunity." "Copper specimens? Nicollet certainly leaves no stone unturned. What about you? Are you a fan or are you a colleague?" Hold on, that didn't make any sense. There it is. "What about you? Are you a fan or are you a colleague? I feel like a fraud." Gray was still rail thin as if an emaciated college student, but his cheeks still could not muster a beard, and his short, dark hair looked the same as it did when he was a volunteer a decade earlier. "I suppose I am just an anonymous fan, Dr. Jackson." Gray waited another half hour for the crowd to thin, Dr. Jackson to receive his copper samples, and for Professor Nicollet to finally make his way to the front doors. When he reached them, Gray called out, "Professor Nicollet, I believe I have something you are looking for." Nicollet's smile vanished, and he quickly whispered something to the man escorting him, who marched through the doors and into the darkness. Nicollet's exodus halted, and the small man put his hands on his hips before saying, "I do not believe we have had the pleasure of an introduction." Gray introduced himself and vigorously shook his hand. A few others interrupted for a pat on the back or a brief comment, but Gray stood toe-to-toe with Nicollet, who stood his ground. The college commons was nowhere near empty, with small circles of conversation still happening. But Gray felt it was private enough to begin. "I believe this belongs to you." Gray pulled the vasculum from his coat pocket, and with both hands held the tin cylinder for Nicollet to see. Nicollet's eyes tightened for a moment as he inspected the ornate carving of a field and forest with a distinctly German castle in the background. Suddenly, Nicollet's eyes darted around the room before he said, "Please put that back immediately." Gray obliged. "Do you recognize it?" "Of course I recognize it, but it certainly does not belong to me. I am not responsible for the theft, and received the ill-gotten gains mostly by chance. It took quite a bit of analysis to determine your connection to it." "The contents?" "Yes, the contents of the vasculum certainly limited the possibilities," Gray said. Nicollet stepped closer, this time to whisper, "How did you come by this?" "As I said earlier, I've only recently begun my professorship here at Harvard, and spent the better part of a year studying and looking for suitable employment. When Harvard accepted my application, I sent for my belongings and private specimens I collected for my professorship at the University of Michigan. Not only were my belongings sent, but there were also 4 crates of specimens that did not belong to me. The University of Michigan. I was to be its first professor of botany, and the Board of Regents sent me to Europe to create a grand collection. I purchased and collected every sample for them, yet I knew immediately that these samples were not mine. I was on the verge of writing Mr. Schoolcraft and the other regents when I discovered this vasculum with wildflower samples. Am I correct in assessing that they came from your 1838 expedition? As it so happens, the vasculum you have in your possession personally belonged to Carl Geyer. An entire wagon full of specimens from our expedition vanished on the way to St. Louis. There were rumors that it had been sent, by accident, into Wisconsin, but no one could determine what happened to it after that. The University of Michigan. Yes, but I can assure you, when I left, none of these specimens were part of the collection. I just wanted to make sure they were returned. I'm sure the thief was sorely disappointed to learn the value of the wagon was only flowers and ferns, and I am sure whoever delivered these to the university did so for the betterment of science and learning. Luckily, Carl Geyer will be visiting me soon, and I will let him know that our lost specimens have been found. Until then, keep them safe here at Harvard, Professor Gray. Nicollet again vigorously shook his hand and then slipped out the front door to the waiting coach. Chapter 72. By the 1730s, the world had begun to call the 13 colonies Columbia, a female goddess based upon the Latinized name of Columbus. Although one of the newest deities in human history, Columbia had roots that reached back in time past the neoclassic fervor, discovering during the founding of the new nation. The Romans once knew her as Libertas, while the Greeks saw her as Eleutheria and Athena. From the District of Columbia to the capital of South Carolina, she became a visual symbol of the United States as a beautiful robed woman holding objects such as a light, a cornucopia, a parrot, or even a severed human head. The popular symbol was applied to universities, rivers, territories, companies, and even a country during the Spanish-American Wars of Independence. Although symbolically replaced by the Statue of Liberty in later times, her use and conceptual worship left an indelible mark on American history. While early Americans came to the colonies as religious refugees, others came seeking freedom in a land where church and state were separate. As a result, Columbia, as well as Providence, became a spiritual icon for manifest destiny, which sought to bring light, knowledge, and transformation to the North American continent. Through conquest and annexation, the Old World would be reborn as a new heaven. Having been born in Baku, where his people still worshipped fire as a deity, Krasden Krai easily took to worshipping the goddess Columbia, even if she was only a concept and offered nothing to humans that they could not provide for themselves. By contrast, Joseph Nicollet still publicly worshipped an old world trinity, and once again stood in the way. Despite the delays, the Nicollet's map is exceptional, the clerk said to Krai, his hands upon his hips. His report is also finished. I have also set it out for both of you to see. Both will need congressional approval before printing, but considering the quality of both, I don't see any issues with his work. Krai recognized Lake Superior in the upper right corner, as well as St. Louis along the bottom of the map. The twists and turns of the Missouri River also remained vivid in his mind, even if the map did them little justice. Because of manifest destiny, another blank space had been filled, even if Nicollet filled it with references to the Old World. There are always issues and delays with projects such as these. Professor Nicollet has been meticulous in his calculations, and after all of his efforts, I believe he is ready to move on to another challenge. Has he spoken to you about future expeditions? I have mostly inferred. I believe he means to join with Fremont on an expedition to the upper Missouri River. I've heard his health has been deteriorated in recent months. Yes, he was quite ill for a stretch, but recently, after changing his living quarters and diet, seems to be a new man. He is like a cockroach that needs to be stepped on a dozen times. Cry found himself staring down at 100 names, some obscure Indian titles and others he recognized, such as Benton, Hebert, Poncet, Fremont, and Lee. There were 2 other names that twisted in his belly, Le Sueur and Lahontan. Despite Nicollet's recent attempts to stop the tide of manifest destiny, he'd done little to sway perception of the American Indian, and the French pebble in the shoe of Cry's benefactor might have been ignored. But putting the names Le Sueur and Lahontan upon the government publication would not be ignored, nor would the most audacious act labeling a large section with the bold word Undine. Is that an Indian word? Cry asked, feigning ignorance over the phrase that would send fanatics like the Order of Eos into hysterics. It's hard to understand Professor Nicollet some days. In many cases, he took careful measure to give places accurate Indian names, and other times he'd name a place after someone who met him the day he held the pencil. Undine? I think he wrote about it in his report to Congress. Could you show me? The clerk for the offices of the United States Corps of Topographical Engineers did not know his name, nor he his, but understood Cry represented wealthy donors who helped advance careers. He found Nicollet's large tome that justified 5 years of governmental paychecks. Here it is, the clerk said after flipping pages. It is in his summary of his 1838 expedition. It has something to do with a Germanic tale. A Germanic tale? Not alchemy. Cry slid the open report toward himself and leaned down to read the page. His maimed hand held the page from moving. Nicollet wrote, "The term Undine is derived from that of an interesting and romantic German tale, the heroine of which belonged to an extensive race of water spirits living in the brooks and rivers and lakes, whose father was a mighty prince. She is, moreover, the niece of a great brook, the Mankato, who lived in the midst of the forests and were surrounded by many a great streams of the surrounding country. I do not know why I fancied an analogy between the ideal country described in the tale and that of the one before me, but I involuntarily, as it were, adopted the name." Involuntarily? Is he talking of Benton, a girl with a mighty father? Cry straightened his back while the clerk leaned in to say, "The Undine region sounds lovely." "Yes," Cry said, "lovely. This is Nicollet's final alteration of the map?" "Yes, Congress has funded a printing and publication as soon as it is approved. Will it be approved?" Cry quickly checked other areas, the headwater of the Des Moines, the St. Peter, the Mississippi. 1,000 labels were placed upon the map, but only one whimsical name, the Undine. Involuntarily. For the past dozen years, he'd known about Professor Nicollet's connection to the Drummond map, and having seen it himself, Cry knew exactly why Nicollet placed the words Le Sueur, Lahontan, and Undine upon it. There were even little X's placed upon the map so the world would know where he'd been, if they knew what they were looking for. Cry felt the weight of his weapons in his pockets, calling to him like a hungry bird needing to be fed. But there was no reason to kill the clerk, who had no idea who he was or who he worked for. Yet he also knew Nicollet would not be allowed to travel back to the west, nor would the map be printed as such. Now he'd have to kill Nicollet, involuntarily. Chapter 73. Nicollet will love the Rocky Mountains, Fremont decided. 100 miles in the distance, he saw the peaks from the deck of his steamer. He once again traveled the same route he'd taken in 1842, but this time he was equipped to push past South Pass of the Wyoming Territory and through the Rockies. His goal? A map of the Oregon Trail. With Jesse's writing skill, he turned his trip into a national adventure story in the newspapers, resulting in a second expedition of 40 men, a 12-pound howitzer cannon, and his own Tiope, Kit Carson. Carson sat alone, refusing the company of any other men. Once unleashed upon the Rockies, he would often ride ahead, return for a quick update, and then vanish again. Jesse had made Carson a celebrity, colorfully describing the Indian fighter and mountain man in her newspaper stories, but the bitter guide wanted no part in the fame. He still mourns his young wife, Fremont observed, watching Carson at the nose of the steamer. Carson was medium height, broad-shouldered, and deep-chested, hardly an imposing figure like Jim Tiope, but he had the narrow eyes of a killer. The previous summer, Fremont had been looking for one of Stuart's mountain men, Thomas Fitzpatrick, when he ran into Carson, who morosely asked, "Have you found him yet?" Fremont had all but forgotten the name Daniel Lyons, but Carson hadn't. Behind every bush, tree, and boulder along the Platte, Carson searched for the enigmatic man who'd brought smallpox to the upper Missouri. When this expedition is over, I hope you can return with me to Washington, if only so I can introduce you to Nicollet. He will want to hear all about your adventures. You're assuming we will survive, Carson said. Although only 4 years his senior, Carson seemed to carry decades' worth of cynicism. We'll be going through Shoshone territory, and then only God knows what else. Even so, Fremont remained optimistic. I want you to meet Nicollet. He taught me everything I know about map-making, and much more. Carson grumbled, only able to connect the word Nicollet with the name Lyons. Fremont understood the sacrifice he would make for Nicollet. A map of the Oregon Trail could take the better part of a year, and by that time, Nicollet's return to Minnesota would be complete. With Father DeSmit, Baron Stewart, and himself all exploring the Missouri River in some fashion or another, the giant Brunia had been sent back to the Minnesota Territory for a private expedition. If successful, Nicollet would be smuggled out of the country, along with the Philosopher's Stone, never to be seen in public again. Even though Fremont knew he traveled upon another long river, just as Stewart and DeSmit also intended to distract the zealots, he found the legend hard to believe. Nor could he speak openly of it to a man like Kit Carson. So the two quietly stood together and waited for the shadows of the Rocky Mountains to return. Chapter 74. Copper is one of the few metals in nature that can be directly used, which made it popular with early humans. Its use can be traced back thousands of years to cultures around the globe. Another unique aspect of copper is that its natural color is different than most silver or gray metals, and instead appears as a robust orange-red color. Whereas iron will rust when placed in contact with water, copper does not react with water, but does react with air, creating a green layer of verdigris that acts as a bonding layer that protects the underlying metal. Copper sulfate, with the chemical formula blah, 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 is commonly referred to as copper vitriol and appears as crystals that are bright blue. Unlike oxidized copper, copper sulfate contains water and typically contains 4 sizes of crystal. Dr. Charles T. Jackson, a prominent New England geologist, specialized in surveying areas for copper mines, as well as determining the chemical quality of samples. For this reason, Joseph Nicollet met with him after a speech at Harvard University several months earlier. Jackson gathered Nicollet's sample tins and shoved them into a travel bag. Then he went back to his analysis report reading over them one more time. Nicollet is testing me, and I don't know what question he's asked, Jackson realized. All I have are the answers to this strange riddle. Purportedly, Nicollet had taken the samples while on his expeditions in the West. But the only labels on the tins were simple letters, leaving Jackson with a blind analysis. However, rumors floated that Nicollet had approached another geologist, Jacob Bailey of West Point, with the same task. The clue had been a sample of green sand unique to New Jersey, which contained multiocular shells from the family Foraminifera. My microscope cannot be so easily fooled, Professor Nicollet. Besides the weak attempt at trickery with the green sand samples, Jackson also found the two samples contained crystals, indicating that they were engineered in a laboratory rather than discovered in the open wilderness as Nicollet claimed. I know copper ore when I see it. Other rumors said Nicollet planned another grand adventure, now that his health had recovered. Jackson had intended on delivering the copper analysis during the previous winter, but Nicollet's health had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. Ferdinand Hassler, Nicollet's friend and mentor, wrote that Nicollet suffered from stomach issues, headaches, and even applied blisters. The appointment would wait for another time. All symptoms of arsenic poisoning, Jackson thought to himself at the time. With the arrival of spring, Nicollet's health returned. According to the most recent letter, Nicollet currently resided at Gallibrand's Hotel, an embassy for French travelers on the outskirts of Washington. Nicollet had a trip planned on September 15th, forcing Jackson to make the trip over the coming weekend. He wrote to Nicollet that he'd visit on Sunday, September 10th, so that he could return his samples and discuss his findings. As a former physician, Jackson also planned to examine Nicollet's health, writing, "Pray take care of yourself. Men of true science are not so abundant that we can spare you. If I pass the test with the copper samples, perhaps he will invite me on his next expedition," Jackson hoped, and set the samples and analysis near the front door beside his travel bags. Chapter 75. Saturday nights at Gallibrand's Hotel reminded Nicollet of Paris. Unlike the drunken debaucheries of the Germanic parties in St. Louis, the guests of the Gallibrands showed refined control, bringing a symphony of chuckles and conversation that at times drowned out the fiddle and piano in the corner. Nicollet had left his own fiddle in a storage shed at Ferdinand Hassler's country home, but he also knew his fingers were not as dexterous as they'd once been. He also did not feel the need to prove himself and watch the younger men strut their talents and boast about their accomplishments. He chose to sit in a booth in the back of the lobby, observing it all, knowing it would be his last weekend of civilized society before he returned to cold comforts of the wilderness. 3 years of planning and waiting rendered down to a few days. Nicollet thought of Shatek, Shagobay, Sleepy Eyes, Wahanaten, Black Heron, and even Violohansi. First I must find the white egg, if I am worthy to be Wishwe. Before he could join the others in St. Louis, he first had to make the journey back to Minnesota. In a few days, the others would meet him at Gallibrand's Hotel, and then he would vanish from this place in the spotlight. The waitress set a wine glass down in front of him and said, "Compliments of Mr. Agassiz." Nicollet looked down at the glass, and from the smell and color, recognized a finer Bordeaux than Gallibrand's Hotel served. Although he'd never met Louis Agassiz, he knew the name well enough. The waitress turned toward a dark-haired man still wearing his jacket at a table near the front window. Along with a travel satchel, Agassiz had a bottle of wine and a glass of Bordeaux in front of him. He raised a glass in a professional salute. Nicollet reciprocated the gesture and offered the seat across from him at the booth. Agassiz clumsily struggled with the heavy satchel before collecting the bottle of wine and glass and crossing the busy lobby. He set the glass and bottle on the table and then vigorously shook Nicollet's hand with both of his hands clamped over it. I apologize for the interruption, but I've been an admirer of yours for a long, long time. If not for the July Revolution. Yes, you and Humboldt left for Berlin, Nicollet recalled. The Swiss scientist had a head of thick dark hair and deeply mysterious eyes with a discerning twinkle in them. Although cleanly shaven, a shadow of a dark beard already presented itself. With broad shoulders and a lean frame, he looked as if he could lead an expedition through any terrain. Please sit, Mr. Agassiz. Any friend of Humboldt's is a friend of mine. I'm sorry to intrude like this, but when I heard that the renowned savant was staying so near, I had to stop before leaving the area. Well, I'm glad you took the initiative. I'd heard you were traveling the British Isles. I was, but I finished my studies and have produced a book. Humboldt told me all about your own study of the Chamonix glaciers near your own home of Savoy. I always felt like a dwarf walking around in the shoes of a giant. You are the master of so many fields, whereas Agassiz reached into his satchel and slid a book across the table. Etudes sur les glaciers by Louise Agassiz. Nicollet picked it up and flipped through some of the pages. This is no chance meeting. He is here not only because of personal jealousy, but also because of my big mouth. Have you come to debate me, Louis? On the contrary, I've come to discuss your findings and remarks on the James River. When you described how the valley had been scooped out by some powerful denuding cause, I knew we had to meet. I think you've come here to debate me, Louis. You've caught me at a strange time. I plan to travel soon, and the details of this trip have left me a little distracted. I'd like you to keep this book. It is my personal copy with notes from my lectures. Wherever you are traveling, let it keep you company and give you food for thought. How can I debate with something that exists in black and white, fixed and unchangeable? Nicollet asked. Glaciers are proof that even the most stubborn boulder can be worn away and removed by the progress of time, Agassiz said with a wry smile. If you don't want to discuss glaciers, perhaps we could discuss other matters. Tell me about this trip you are taking. Tell me about the Indians of the West. This is going to be a long night. Perhaps it'll take my mind off of things for a while. First, a toast to Alexander von Humboldt, our mentor. Nicollet raised his glass, and so did Agassiz, who carefully held the glass with a hand deprived of 2 fingers. Chapter 76. Sweat trickled down Davy Faribault's face and into the cloth of his soaked collar. The heat was becoming more than he could take. We will be reaching your destination in Baltimore in just a few minutes, the train attendant told him, after having been with him for most of the sweltering day. Faribault glanced over at the ogre sleeping beside him in the aisle seat and simply shrugged, choosing to wait in the heat of the day rather than wake his gruff traveling companion. Outside the window, Faribault could see the urban sprawl growing denser, making it impossible to picture Nicollet in such a place. Dressed in a traveling jacket, Faribault let the heat begin to fester in his mind. He tried to loosen the top buttons of his shirt to allow more airflow. Beside him, Sergeant Jim Tyope slept in a loose cotton shirt, unbuttoned halfway to his navel. Upon his head, he wore an ornate smoking cap with a foxtail that replaced the original tassel and a large eagle feather that added an extra foot to his height. Faribault had insisted on Tyope wearing his old uniform to discourage thieves, but his traveling companion had also kept his sheathed knife strapped to his thigh. "Jim," Faribault elbowed his friend. "Jim, wake up." Tyope simply grunted. Faribault found himself wincing as he looked at the right side of Tyope's face. Even after living a life out on the frontier, Faribault felt like a green novice compared to Tyope. "Jim, wake up." Faribault tried again, and a white eye opened. The train is pulling into the station. We need to be ready to disembark. Tiope again grunted, carefully adjusted his circular smoking cap, and grabbed the seat in front of him for leverage. As soon as the two stepped out of the train car, the air quality improved, and Faribault felt a little less anxious. After crossing the platform of paving stones and steel, he scanned the streets for the hotel Nicollet described to them. He found Gallibrand's Hotel quickly, leading Tiope right to the front door. Large fans run by a system of pulleys provided a cool breeze to the patrons. At a table along the wall, a group of 3 soldiers nodded at Tiope, even though Faribault doubted if any of them had ever crossed the Mississippi. "What can I get for you fellas?" the bartender asked. "We're here to meet someone," Faribault said. "That doesn't mean you can't refresh yourself while you wait." "I'll have a hard apple cider." Faribault nodded and searched for a few coins in his pocket. "Tennessee whiskey," Tiope grunted. Faribault nervously watched as the bartender tried to make sense of his companion's dark features, but dressed in civilized clothes, Tiope was quickly served. "His room is upstairs?" Tiope asked, finally, after taking a swig of his whiskey. "Yes, on the 2nd floor," Faribault answered. The two men burst in through the front door, causing Faribault to spill a little of his cider. Annoyed, he watched a younger man leading an older man with a medical bag through the inn and to the back. A few minutes later, the frantic young man in the silk bow tie returned from the back room. "Can we get some help? There is a man who is sick. We need to carry him to a carriage." The young man's plea fell on deaf ears. "Please!" Tiope cleared his throat and tossed back the last bit of whiskey, leaving Faribault behind. From the bar, Faribault could hear excited voices coming from the back room, including more words from Tiope than he'd heard in a week of traveling. "David!" Tiope called out from the doorway, suddenly using his first name. With the eyes of the tavern upon him, Faribault nervously walked to the rear. 3 slaves stood in a corner near the entrance to the water closets, watching with wide eyes as the doctor tended to the man lying on the floor. Although the man's pants were down around his ankles, a blanket had been tossed over his legs to give him a little dignity. Puddles of bloody vomit pooled on the wooden floorboards beside him. The man with the silk bow tie stood, with tears in his eyes, holding another heavy blanket that would have been used to transport the man. Still reacting to the smells of illness and death lingering in the air of the narrow hallway, Faribault wrinkled his brow indignantly when he saw Tiope drop to his knees and take a hold of the dying man's right hand. "You know him?" the man in the silk bow tie asked, when he, too, saw the grim ogre drop to his knee. Tiope nodded, ripping his ornate smoking cap from his head to wipe away the beaded sweat and trickle of vomit from the dying man's face. The act of gentle compassion, as well as the gruesome pink scars upon Tiope's exposed scalp, made Faribault queasy. The dying man's bright red vest and white undershirt had been torn open to expose a thin white chest struggling to take in a full breath. I've contacted his colleagues," the young man in the silk bow tie told the older doctor, who was listening to the dying man's labored breathing with his stethoscope. "A carriage will be arriving soon to take him to the closest hospital. This man would die if we transported him right now," the elderly doctor explained as his focus turned to the man's spotted hands. "His lungs are filling with fluids." "Oh, dear God, does the man have smallpox?" Faribault wondered, remembering the epidemic that had swept through the frontier. But the dark little dots were relegated to the man's palms and did not boil and bubble like smallpox. "This is an important man, Doctor," Tiope nodded, sniffling a bit. "Is the brute crying?" Faribault recoiled. "What is wrong with him?" "Whatever this man needs, give it to him," Tiope insisted. "Money is no obstacle. Faribault, give him some money." Money will not save this poor fellow, the older doctor said. The only thing we can do for him is find a bed and a priest. I think this man has been poisoned. At that, Tiope slammed the doctor by his collar, grabbed the doctor by his collar, and slammed him against the narrow wall of the hallway. Don't say such things. Save him. Then the dying man's eyes fluttered open and looked right at him. Suddenly, the narrow hallway spun, and Faribault had to put a hand on the wall to keep his balance. Look what they have done to me, Professor Nicollet spoke in a tattered whisper. It was impossible to see the jovial eyes, the gentle smile, and the dark flop of hair that once swept down over the man's brow. Instead, he saw a gray face with hollow eyes. Faribault dropped his satchel and pushed his way past the doctor, taking the spotted hand in his own, kissing the top of it. Professor Nicollet, it's Davy. We will watch over you now. Chapter 77. By late evening, after watching Joseph Nicollet drift in and out of consciousness, Jim Tiope positioned his chair a few feet from the bed. In the corner of the room, Davy Faribault sat, despondent, by a dresser, while the spectacled doctor, Charles Jackson, paced nervously at the foot of the bed. If I had known he was sick, I would have insisted he see a doctor. Well, then, okay. Instead of meeting me over matters of geology, I didn't know. I just didn't know. My wife had heard rumors, but there was no indication in his letters that his condition was this grave. Poisoning. That had been the initial diagnosis of Nicollet's illness. Tiope could see the symptoms growing worse by the minute as Nicollet's lungs labored for breath. Dr. Jackson, the fault does not lie on you, Faribault said after running his fingers through his hair. You can leave. We were his traveling companions. We accept responsibility for his care. The nervous doctor took a few steps toward the door and stopped. I have something. It is a soil analysis that he asked me to complete. Jackson set the papers on the stack of books that had been earlier found in Nicollet's possession. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, Faribault said. As soon as Jackson left, Faribault whispered in Nicollet's ear, Professor Nicollet, it is Tiope. Who did this to you? Nicollet's eyes fluttered. I saw her, Nicollet whispered softly. She was waiting for me in the waters. She tried to... Found who, Professor Nicollet? Tiope whispered insistently. He's hallucinating, Tiope said. Beads of sweat covered Nicollet's brow, and his body randomly convulsed. We were there, boys. I was so close, but I could not see her. Now she has come for me, Nicollet whispered before a fit of coughing shook him terribly. But I didn't let her steal my soul. I tricked her. Rest, Professor Nicollet. Rest, Professor. The other doctor will be back any minute with some better medicine. Understand? Nicollet managed a slight smile and nodded. Tiope rose and began to inspect the room. A crime scene, Tiope noted. Already he'd spoken to the bartender, who explained that Nicollet had met with a dark-haired man who had brought books and his own bottle. Tiope found both books and an empty bottle of wine in the room. The books were Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, George Fanshaw's Geological Reports, Truce, Geological Reports of Tennessee, Alexander von Humboldt's and Louis Agassiz's Etudes sur les Gracias. The bartender had explained that shortly before Tiope and Faribault arrived, Dr. Jackson asked about Nicollet and went upstairs to call on him. Jackson was not the same man as the Saturday visitor. Nicollet had already put his belongings in storage, although he was a scientist. The presence of the 5 books seemed out of place, especially with the bartender mentioning the wine and books brought by the dark-haired man. Tiope flipped through the books for a moment. At the table by the window, he found an assortment of notebooks written in the hand of Nicollet. He thumbed through them until he found a few drawings that included a turtle, a woman surrounded by lily pads, a man on fire, and some sort of water serpent. He slipped the notebooks into his shirt. "Are you stealing those?" Faribault asked. "I am no thief," Tiope snapped. "If Nicollet dies, this can't be found in his possession." "What are you talking about? Put it back. You can't even read." "Then I will find someone who can," Tiope added, stuffing the canisters in his leather satchel. "Those might be important." Tiope nodded, snatched Dr. Jackson's analysis, and added it to the satchel. "I will keep it safe until we can find someone who can make sense of it." It only took a few minutes to search the rest of the hotel room. "What are you looking for?" Faribault finally asked. "The green box. It held a wampum belt and his journal, along with all of his other valuables. I once saw Colton trying to break into it." "Edgar Colton?" Tiope nodded. "Another time. Right now, we need to find that box before it's too late." He returned to the 5 books, slipping each of them inside the satchel also. A few minutes later, the elderly doctor returned out of breath with several bottles in a leather-bound box. He quickly fed Nicollet a few tablespoons of concoction while providing comfort for his fever. Tiope stood with his arms crossed while they watched the doctor, finally whispering into Faribault's ear, "We need to talk in private." Tiope led Faribault into the quiet stairway and stopped at the top of the stairwell, leading down to the tavern. "Did you hear what Nicollet first said to us?" "Yes, but he was hallucinating." "Do you remember what the first doctor said?" "Do you remember what Jackson said?" "He thought Nicollet might be poisoned." "Or it could just be pneumonia," Faribault added. "Even if it was poisoning, who in God's name would want to poison him?" "Nicollet knew things," Tiope insisted. "Dangerous things. When we first met him, he was already on a dangerous path. Someone did not want him taking another trip." "But who?" 4 sharply dressed men appeared at the bottom of the stairs, drawing their attention. The grim men steadily ascended the stairs. "Can we help you fellas?" Tiope said, giving them a cold shoulder. "You must be Hassler," Faribault politely smiled. "No, we were sent to retrieve Professor Nicollet. Is he up here?" Faribault nodded, but Tiope stood in the way. "Who sent you?" "We work for the Corps of Topographical Engineers. Colonel Hebert sent us as soon as he heard the news." Tiope held his ground until all the men were suddenly aware of the presence behind them. The elderly doctor. "Science has been deprived by too early a death," he declared, and only then did Tiope step away to find support at the railing of the stairs. Hebert's men quickly rushed by, and in a daze, Tiope slowly descended the stairs to the bar below. At the bar, Tiope ordered a shot of whiskey. A few minutes later, Faribault slid up beside him. "He's dead." Faribault then set down a $10 bill on the counter. "Give us a bottle of your Tennessee whiskey." He filled Calliope's cup and then filled his own. To Professor Nicollet, may his journey be swift. Calliope finished half of Faribault's whiskey bottle before he understood what needed to be done. Reaching into the satchel, he found the samples. 2 of them belonged to Joseph Nicollet. One canister, which he removed, was slightly different. Someone killed Nicollet to keep him from going on another expedition. Somehow they knew we were coming to meet with him. Who? Calliope rotated the tin specimen. On a white label on the front, it read, "Property of Harvard University." We'll start by asking Dr. Jackson a few questions.